Hi, this is just the first video on the poem Marina by TS Eliot. There's been a lot of misinformation, I've noticed, spoken about this poem, almost as if you can understand it without reference to TS Eliot's life, work, allusions and references and his own comments on it. Now, the argument with poetry is it autonomous? Can you understand it without reference to anything else? Or do you need to know what the references are? So what I'm going to try and do is point towards some of the things that will help us understand this. And for this, I need to talk to you just briefly about T.S. Eliot generally, and if you like, an approach to his poetry as a general theme. A close reading is required with his poetry. It is impossible to just read it through a couple of times and get a full grasp of it. It has to be read again and again, and each layer that you read, you look further into where the references lead you, and then you put them back together again to see the beauty of the construction. Knowledge of his allusions is required and how they're being used. He was a man who was very well read and used his Shakespeare and his classical Dante and so on in order to make points, almost like ready-made images that he could hang his own ideas on. That's really how he used them. And he adapted them for his own purposes, really. And it's that adaptation that is the skill and the art, a little bit like Shakespeare, where he would take a play ready written, but the way he recast it into his own language was the art itself. So, what seas, what shores, what grey rocks and what islands, what water lap in the bow, and scent of pine and wood thrush singing through the fog, what images return, oh my daughter. So we have in Pericles by Shakespeare, the king is reunited with his daughter. He thought she was dead, and in fact she's not. The mother died giving birth, but she was taken by pirates, sold into a brothel, and then years later in Act 5, Scene 1 of Pericles, the monumental scene of reconciliation, or rather revelation. 1927 saw the year when T.S. Eliot converted into Christianity, and if you look at the poetry of, say, The Waste Land and compare it to, say, the 1936 Murder in the Cathedral, you'll see the way his thinking and beliefs have changed. And this is one of the first vehicles for that. Think of a church. The main part of a church is the nave. Nave, the nave, comes from a Latin word navis, which means navy, to sail, ship, to sail to God. And this is what this whole poem is about. The ship that is so disastrous, as we shall see later, needs to be remade. His whole life has been disastrous up to this point. But the same emotions that Pericles got from seeing his long-lost daughter are the, if you like, emotions that come with his rebirth of faith, his rebirth in Christ. And if you interpret the poem as he always wanted a daughter, there's that story where he wheeled a friend's daughter round the square in London where he worked in Faber and Faber, and as if, what would it be like to have a daughter? That is only a small part of it. That's not the main thrust of the poem. The main thrust of the poem is his faith and hope. And if we look at these first few lines for a moment and look at the poetry of them, he was influenced by Walt Whitman here. Listen to this. What widens within you, Walt Whitman? What waves and soils exuding? What climes, what persons and cities are here? Who are the infants? Who, some playing, some slumbering? Who are the girls? Who are the married women? Who are the groups of old men going slowly with their arms about each other's necks? Interesting reference to Yeats there, isn't it? This is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, an influence from Walt Whitman. What a poet Walt Whitman was, what a brain. But here the what that's repeated is used by T.S. Eliot here as this. Think of the epigram in Latin. What place is this? What land? What part of the world? This is where Hercules had awoken from a dream where he had killed his wife and children under a spell of the gods, and when he sees them and he can't understand where he is, T.S. Eliot himself said he wanted to use that to interweave the idea of that shock with a good shock of reawakening. So when he says what seas, what shores, this is the prelude to meeting the daughter. This is the prelude for the new insight into life, his faith, if you like. What seas, what shores, what grey rocks and what islands. Incidentally, when he was asked about this in 1958, that's 28 years, I believe, after he wrote it, he said that he couldn't reference many other places outside of America, places like Maine and the North East and so on, but he had to have a place in mind. But artistically, this has been just transcribed into the rocks of the shore, where the ship is coming to grief, if you like. The scent of pine and the wood thrush singing through the fog. What images return, oh my daughter? He often used to say about the images, why is it that some images stick in the mind and evoke certain emotions, whereas others don't? And here we have a problem. The images that evoked particular emotions for him are not necessarily going to be the images that evoke the same emotion for us as readers. But this is part of the complexity of the communication of poetry and language generally, isn't it? The associative power of a word and a phrase might be different to you than to me. But, oh my daughter, is the Pericles bit, but also the vehicle he's using to say, look, something wonderful that I thought I'd lost, I've regained. And a lot of what I'm saying can later be borne out by interreferences in the text and the way they cohere together. As one of the things with reading a poem, I believe, is it has to make sense within the unity of the poem. This idea of reading in and reading out, what you read into the poem from yourselves might not be as valid as what you read out, which is already there, can have evidence for why it's there. And what I'm going to be looking at in future videos is how the things I'm saying are borne out by things that happen later on in the poem. Those who sharpen the tooth of the dog, meaning death. Those who glitter with the glory of the hummingbird, meaning death. Those who sit in the sty of contentment, meaning death. Those who suffer the ecstasy of the animals, meaning death. One way of looking at those incantatory lines is to think of the deadly sins: gluttony, tooth of the dog, glory of the hummingbird is pride, sty of contentment could be sloth, laziness, and ecstasy of the animals could be lust. There could be 4 of the 7 deadly sins coded, if you like, into this imagery. But when you look closer, these are images of death. Sharpen the dog's tooth for dog fights, if you like. Glory of the hummingbird. I have to read you a reference for this one. This is interesting. Listen to this. D.H. Lawrence quotes about hummingbirds. They often fight with the fury of lions. You know, it's the idea that they use their little bit of energy in a deadly fight, like a lion, is, it might seem like a glory with the glitter of their plumage, if you like, but in actual fact, there's death there in that image. Those who sit in the sty of contentment. Now, this is not the sty in the eye, this is pigsty. and you think you're content, but you're not. You're in a bad place. The ecstasy of the animals. Those who suffer the ecstasy, meaning death. But what does all this mean? What do all these four mean? Well, surely he's talking about the life he led when he didn't think he had his daughter. This is Pericles, so everything was underpinned by death. Nothing. It's like Ecclesiastes. Nothing had any purpose or meaning or anything. When this is going to change now, because he becomes a man new made when he sees his daughter. T.S. Eliot is using this idea that he will become a man new made as a Christian, a saved soul. So he's looking at his older life. He later on goes on to talk about the boat and how that is falling to bits and how he needs a new one, and he's responsible for that, just like we're responsible for our lives. And if our boat falls to pieces and ends up shipwrecked, it's us to blame, isn't it, to a certain extent? Without getting into deeper thoughts about predestination, free will versus sovereignty of God, and so on. You are captain of your own ship to a certain extent. Shakespeare said there's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. So to a certain extent we're in control of some things and not another. But in this particular poem, we're talking about his control over his own life and his own ship. But I'm going to stop there now, and I'm going to be doing at least another video for the second part, the later part, maybe a third video if I can't fit it all in. But I'm going to try and show the cohesion of interpretation, but then also to look at some of the poetic qualities of this, scent of pine and wood thrush singing through the fog. I mean, the beauty of that line, the way the words are put together, and the image that's created. That's all the important part of it. But underneath it is this swelling meaning. He's using the beauty of the poetry to forward the swelling meaning, if you like, as we go through. Beautiful, beautifully written. Not that well known a poem, not particularly famous poem of his, but one that is well worth studying, I think, and reading through. On YouTube, there's actually T.S. Eliot's voice reading it, which is interesting. So, I'll leave you there, and I'll continue with that at a later date for the next part of this appreciation, if you like, of this poem.